As a part of my broader analysis of Pablo Torre's strongest evidence, I rewatched the podcast episode with Mark Cuban. And as I was watching the episode, I thought to myself, I really need to have a breakdown of this because here we not only have what is essentially Steve Ballmer and the Clippers' best defense, but we also have unique insight into someone who is not only an NBA owner, minority owner at this time, but he was a majority owner. We have a billionaire thinking strategically, and we have someone who's familiar with the NBA's inner workings. And so at this point in time, and keep in mind that this is only 2 or 3 days after the initial release of Pablo Torre's reporting on the scandal, but at this point in time, this is essentially what amounts to the Clippers' best defense. And if we can take out these points, then that makes Pablo Torre's reporting that much stronger and his evidence that much stronger. But on the other side, if there are any points where Mark Cuban is able to undermine Pablo Torre's evidence, then we want to know about that. So that's what I've done. I've gone through this episode in very specific deep detail, and I've outlined everything, almost everything, virtually everything has been outlined here in the PDF that's on the screen with me. And right now, we're going to go through some of the highlighted sections I want to emphasize. We're not going to go over everything, but I will link to the PDF in the description for this video. But for now, let's go ahead and we're going to play some clips, and then I'm just going to talk about my analysis of the conversation. So let's go ahead and we'll scroll down the PDF, and we're going to start with the outline, and we're going to start 8 minutes and 20 seconds in.
It was in 2021, before their arena opened, right? Right when Kawhi signed their new contract, and it's $300 million. When you get a deal of that size with a new category sponsor, the NBA has to approve it. So first of all, the NBA had to have looked into this. But that wasn't, the overwhelming thing. Then
I want to note here one thing, that Mark Cuban is saying this, and this sounds strong. This sounds like a strong defense because he's saying that the NBA looked into this, but the defense is only as strong as the NBA. So when we go ahead and examine the NBA looking into this, well, okay, did the NBA was the NBA actually to find was the NBA going to find anything, or could they have found anything? How much scrutiny did they apply when they look into this, or did they just was it just paperwork on the desk and it moved past? So we can't assume that the NBA was diligent and scrutinized this deal with the level of intensity that should have been appropriate for it. And I'm not saying that they should have looked at it different than any other deal that comes across their desk, because not every deal the company ends up being a scam company that defrauds other people, just ignoring the potential salary cap circumvention. But not every deal is problematic. So it's important not to look at it in that lens, but it's also important not to give the NBA too much credit, because here Mark Cuban is really resting upon the NBA. But we'll continue.
They defaulted on that deal. Right? They stopped doing it, and Ballmer made an announcement at some point in time saying that the deal was not moving forward. And this was several years ago. But that wasn't really the trigger for Team Ballmer. The trigger for Team Ballmer was in January of 2024, when it was either the SEC or CFTC said that they were under investigation. So the minute Aspiration was under investigation, I guarantee you, in the immortal words of Charles Barkley, I guarantee it, that the NBA took a hard look at it. And not only that Ballmer, if he did something illicit and under the table and tried to,
Again, we're back to the NBA. So Mark here, his defense is harking back to the NBA. But we can't just bypass this because the NBA looked at it. We don't know the level of detail and scrutiny. And at this point, there should be more scrutiny, right? Because he says he guarantees the NBA would have looked at it at this point. But we can't just assume that the NBA was going to find anything. Recently, I published another video where I talked about how many scandals the NBA has actually uncovered on their own since the year 2000. And the answer is not very many. So we can't just rely upon the NBA looking at this as a defense, but in the light of the fact that the NBA looked specifically into salary cap circumvention, the ultimate result does come back to the NBA, but now things are different because this is now public information. But let's continue with the clip.
Work around the salary cap, then he's got to be bricks, right? Because at that point in time, he's the dumbest human being on the planet because he trusted these scammers to do something he knew was against all NBA rules. A, I just don't see that happening. B, the NBA would have found it easily. 3, and this alludes to the Steve Ballmer can't be that dumb thing. I mean, I guess I've been scammed. Everybody's scammable.
Before he continues, I just don't see that happening is just an opinion, right? It very easily could have happened. So that's a throwaway. Then he goes back to the NBA. And again, the NBA is, in terms of the ultimate result, yes, the NBA is the final decision maker, but now that's different. And then again, how much scrutiny did the NBA apply?
But in order for this to work, in my opinion, he has to trust that whole company. And at that point in time, he trusted them enough to give them an investment at some level, but I don't see how he would trust that company to keep probably his darkest secret as an NBA owner so that it wouldn't get out. I just don't see in any way, shape, or form that all those things could happen.
Well, he had them as the jersey sponsor, so you have to trust them somewhat. But if there is going to be salary cap circumvention, then you're going to need a third party. I mean, there has to be some type of intermediary if you're not going to pay a player directly or a player's representative directly. So there has to be a trust on some level if a third party is going to be involved. Here, you've got a 23-year sponsorship deal for $300 million. I do genuinely believe that the Clippers believe that this company was a real company and they weren't a scam company. And so I think a level of trust was there. And obviously, Steve Ballmer had invested $50 million into them. There was a relationship. There were photo ops. So there was a level of trust. And yeah, it's a deep, dark secret for the Clippers. But it's also, at some point, you're going to have to trust somebody with that. And there's the other part of this, that this type, we rarely see this, right? The last time anybody can remember, or I can remember, is with Joe Smith in the year 2000. So it's a deep, dark secret, but maybe it's not one that's kept so closely because it's just not something that's found out. And again, this doesn't get uncovered unless this company ends up going bankrupt. So the secret was safe and the secret was kept for a while. It just happened to surface because of the bankruptcy proceedings. But let's go ahead and go back to the PDF. And so one other important note here is that early on, Mark is the one that is making, if we look at this, just to put this simply in terms of winning and losing, Mark's actually winning the early on interactions. And that's in part because Pablo is focused on the wrong things. And I think that is because, to a degree, because Pablo is holding on to information that he is not going to reveal until later. We already know that Pablo has subsequent podcasts that he already has in mind. He's going to drip feed information. And so part of this is strategy on Pablo's part. But I also do think Pablo comes across thinking in the wrong way a few different times. And Mark catches him on this and capitalizes on this to make a good point. And I'm not saying that Mark was purposefully capitalizing on it, but Mark has a stronger stance, or a stronger, I don't know how to, I'm not wording it correctly, but Mark comes across stronger in parts of this podcast because Pablo is not focusing on the right thing. And given Pablo was limited here, but Mark makes some good points that Pablo isn't able to counter at a few times. And so that's where we get into different parts of this podcast. One part is micromanaging. So Pablo starts to draw the comparison of, well, Steve Ballmer is focused on optimizing the Intuit Dome, and he's paying attention to every last detail. And then so you would think he would look into this deal. And then Mark says, no, look, like he's optimizing with the Intuit Dome. With the deal, he's not going to concern himself with every last detail that goes on, right? Like there's not enough time in the day. That's actually a phrase Mark uses, and it's absolutely true. Steve, there are other things to do besides focus in on aspiration. Sure, there was some due diligence involved, but it wasn't like Steve Ballmer needed to know everything about aspiration before he was going to engage in this partnership with them. So that was a point where Pablo's just he's looking at this in the wrong light, and Mark was right there. And then continuing on, we get to the higher level of sponsorships with the level of familiarity, and then Pablo asks him if the Clippers are going to do business with someone they don't really know, and would you invest $50 million into their business? And then Mark counters, well, like, yeah, look, Steve has people that are involved in a level of due diligence, but they're not going to go to this level of detail, which makes complete sense. Yes, this was a big partnership for the Clippers, but it's not like with every partnership you find out about every single thing of someone. At some point, you have to move forward and you go based on intuition and the evidence available at hand. Here we have a company that was growing fast, and they had connections, and so I'm sure at some point everything else checked out. And so again, here Mark is right. Pablo's looking at this in the wrong way, because Pablo's also coming at this from a point of view of, hey, you now that I have this knowledge, you should have been looking at all of these things. And that's not how this unfolds in daily life. We don't examine every last detail of every last thing. We're only going to look at things that really, really affect us. And here, obviously, there was a degree of that with aspiration and the sponsorship deal, but I'm sure that the Clippers looked into it to some level, but they weren't going to, they're not going to learn everything about them. There's so much that's going on. There's more. There's just so much going on for Steve Ballmer. So I agree with Mark here. He is making good points. All right, so let's now go to the 19-minute mark this episode.
What I loved about that was it went to the extent of showing how much everyone cared about getting these players.
And for reference, here they're talking about DeAndre Jordan and how Steve Ballmer circumvented the salary cap and was fined for going after DeAndre Jordan and providing him with a sponsorship with Lexus.
I just want to establish that as a general principle. But you're also saying that Steve Ballmer is not the type of person who would want to bend or break the rules of cap circumvention to get such players.
Because you have to look at the risk reward.
So the question I have is, what explains the fact that in that same case of DeAndre Jordan, which of course involved you with the Mavs and Steve Ballmer with the Clippers, why was Steve Ballmer's Clippers team fined $250,000 by the NBA for reportedly offering a Lexus endorsement, arranging a Lexus endorsement, according to reporting, to DeAndre Jordan?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even remember that part happening. That part I don't even recall.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
it did happen though. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying it didn't, right? That would have been dumb. Like, look, if I'm wrong on this and you're...
Okay, so there was a really, that was in favor of Pablo very significantly, because here Mark is not coming to terms with this very direct piece of information, right? It's not specific to what's going on with aspiration, but it is relevant because Steve Ballmer has already done this. And so Mark's theme throughout this episode is that Steve Ballmer is not connected with salary cap circumvention to aspiration in any way. But then when it comes to, hey, let's look at what's happened in the past, Mark Cuban doesn't have an answer for this. And that is highly, highly relevant and shows the degree of bias that Mark has had throughout this whole, ever since Pablo released the initial podcast. That is, I think, Mark Cuban, where he does himself a disservice is you have to acknowledge that more. And he does. We do get back to this later on. But for right now, you can see here, Mark Cuban doesn't really address this. He just says, I don't know. And then we move right past it. So let's actually go back a few seconds and show this again.
Fined $250,000 by the NBA for reportedly offering a Lexus endorsement, arranging a Lexus endorsement, according to reporting, to DeAndre Jordan.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even remember that part happening.
So that's, this is the best defender. Here we have relevant evidence. I think if Mark were to come across better, he would just acknowledge that, like, yeah, that looks bad, because it does. It does really look bad. And his whole, like, if you go through this entire episode, Mark consistently comes back to this isn't connected to Steve Ballmer. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to play a few more seconds just to make sure I finish the clip.
That part I don't even recall.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
it did happen though. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying it didn't, right? That would have been dumb. Like, look, if I'm wrong on this and you're right, then Steve is not as smart as I think he is.
Well, I'm team bricks, Mark, I guess is what I'm saying here. I'm team bricks based on the reporting, right? So I don't want to cut you off because I actually want to know what you're about to say. I just feel like a really smart guy can be so desperate to get a star player that justifies the entire mission of opening a privately funded stadium to compete with the Lakers specifically, who were competing with him. And in fact, when it comes to a bunch of scammers who maybe he didn't know were scammers.
All right, so he continues on, but I think that Pablo should have continued on this line more. So Pablo, and this happened, this was put together really fast. And this is obviously me looking back at the episode, literally spending hours on this episode. But my analysis is that when you have a point where Mark Cuban really can't argue it, then you have to go into it deeper. And so this would have been one of those times where you continue to hammer away at this one point because it is so relevant to what's going on. Here we have an owner who has already circumvented the salary cap before, and you're saying you just don't see a way that he's circumventing the salary cap this time, and you're relying upon the fact that there's no connection. Well, this is highly relevant to your entire point, so you have to concede it. And actually, I think I heard Mark briefly there say you're right. I think one other point with Pablo is that sometimes he doesn't just leave the discussion. Like if he just stopped talking and didn't add in a second point, let Mark continue, I think it would have served him better. But that's a really strong point of contention. So let's continue on. And so Mark here, later on, Mark says Steve Ballmer doesn't know about the no-show contract. Him helping with business development, that doesn't show that he knows. So he's helping Aspiration with business development in some way, but that doesn't show that he knows about the no-show contract. Mark says it's plausible Steve doesn't know, and that's right. So if this were to be a separate contract, which it's supposed to be, right? Kawhi Leonard's contract with Aspiration is supposed to be completely just Kawhi Leonard and Aspiration coming to whatever agreement that they've come to. All Steve does is introduce them. Mark is right here. It's very plausible that in a theoretical world that Steve Ballmer completely doesn't know about this. So it's really not something for Pablo to pursue. Then Pablo asks, well, why did Kawhi Leonard take less money? And he's referring to, I believe this is in reference to to his deal, to one of his contracts, and to which Mark Cuban says, I don't know. So again, like this is not, you're not going to get anywhere with this line of questioning because that's just trying to read into the subjective mindset of Kawhi Leonard. We don't know. And so it'd be just pure speculation anyway. And so Pablo comes back with, well, I have 7 sources that say it was to circumvent the salary cap, and I have documentation of this. And so we get to another point of emphasis, 2235. So let's go ahead and play that.
Is the contract you're talking about that says if he no longer plays for the Clippers, right?
Yeah, among other things,
Yeah. I mean, I can make the same argument that the scammers benefit as much because of their sponsorship.
Wait, can you explain that one?
So in every huge sponsorship deal, you get tickets, you get appearances, you get all kinds of ancillary, right? And the better the team, the more valuable that is, right? All of our sponsors are going to want to have access to Cooper Flag. Everybody wanted access to Luka, no matter what, right? And part of us getting those bigger deals was giving people access. And so the better the team, the better the stars, the better the value of the sponsorship.
So are you in dispute at all that the deal Kawhi signed?
Okay, and actually I think I skipped over a part. So what Mark's getting at there is that the Clippers being better with Kawhi makes the sponsorship deal for Aspiration that much more valuable. And so for that reason, that Aspiration should want the Clippers to have Kawhi, which is an extremely weak argument. It really doesn't it's such a weak argument on the part of Mark, but that's one of the ways he tries to explain this is, hey, the Clippers are better with Kawhi Leonard, so that's going to make this entire sponsorship deal with Aspiration and the Clippers more valuable to Aspiration, so they'd want to have him here. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I didn't get to the point that I wanted to. Let's try to go back.
And that was his reason. I don't know.
Because I have 7 sources that say it was to circumvent the salary cap, plus the documentation that suggests that that's exactly what happened.
Well, the documentation is the contract you're talking about that says if he no longer plays for the Clippers, right?
Yeah, among other things, yeah.
So Pablo says right there, among other things. That right there, he alludes to the future episodes that he's going to release. And that goes back to what I was saying originally. Part of Pablo's difficulty here, or maybe not difficulty, but part of the reason why he's not, I guess, his side isn't as strong here is because he's purposefully holding back information. So there you heard him allude to, among other things. Let's go back to the outline. Let's see. So then we also heard them talking about the deal, about whether Mark Cuban disputes whether the deal was to circumvent the salary cap. And that's where you heard Mark Cuban say, like, yeah, you haven't shown me anything. And so Mark is right that this is a bad point in that actually, let's go ahead and play the clip. We have 2308. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
So are you in dispute at all that the deal Kawhi signed in that document, as reported, to the extent that you've seen it, that clearly was to circumvent the cap? It's merely that Ballmer was not aware of it. That's the argument that you're making then.
Right. So
who would have known about it at the Clippers then?
Who would have known? Well, wait, no, I don't think anybody knows about it necessarily at the Clippers.
Nobody would have known about the fact that Kawhi Leonard...
You're not. So my logic is different than yours. My logic, I'm putting the hat on of Aspiration.
Yes.
Just the Aspiration hat on, right? If I'm paying Kawhi to do something for me, even if it's a no-show Tony Soprano job, right? He's of no value to me in Dallas.
Yeah.
I can take some of that scam money that I just brought in and let me give it to Kawhi in the deal, because if Kawhi stays, they're probably going to be better. And if they're better, my sponsorship money is worth even more. There's more value to the scammers to doing this deal than there is to Ballmer for doing the Kawhi deal.
So I guess I just want to square the circle here, right? Because the team had a relationship with Aspiration that ended as described in 22-23.
Right.
And that started in 21. The Kawhi contract also started in...
Okay, so he's getting into something separate there. And I think I want to go back because I think what you heard, I think, was out of context. So I want to play
that one?
This again.
So in every huge sponsorship deal, you get tickets, you get appearances, you get all kinds of ancillary, right? And the better the team, the more valuable that is, right? All of our sponsors are going to want to have access to Cooper Flag. Everybody wanted access to Luka, no matter what, right? And part of us getting those bigger deals was giving people access. And so the better the team, the better the stars, the better the value of the sponsorship.
So are you in dispute at all that the deal Kawhi signed in that document, as reported, to the extent that you've seen it, that clearly was to circumvent the cap? It's merely that Ballmer was not aware of it. That's the argument that you're making then.
Right. So
who would have known about it at the Clippers then?
Who would have known? Well, wait, no, I don't think anybody knows about it necessarily at the Clippers.
Nobody would have known.
Yeah, so this is why I was saying Mark was right. It doesn't, just because Kawhi has a separate deal and it's a no-show deal, that doesn't mean that the Clippers knew about it. So here, it could easily just be a one-to-one with Kawhi and Aspiration, and the Clippers don't need to know about it. Now, obviously, I think that the Clippers do very well know about it, but in this theoretical argument, it's a weak point to make because Kawhi and Aspiration could be just simply working together as they are supposed to be. And what Mark is saying is that, hey, there's this sponsorship deal, and because there's a sponsorship deal it's in Aspiration's best interest that Kawhi remain a Clipper. And so there you see the no-show deal where the only really contingency is that he remain a Clipper for the duration of the deal. That doesn't make practical sense. I mean, yes, it makes sense that Aspiration would want Kawhi to be a Clipper and for the Clippers to be a better team, but it does not make sense in that they're going to pay Kawhi at this point, what is known at the time of this podcast, $28 million to simply be on the Clippers when he's likely going to be on the Clippers anyway. So it's a really, really weak argument. But let's go to 2650.
NBA's Board of Governors. The reporting is that Uncle Dennis made those requests of Lakers owner Jeannie Buss, quote, and that she made it clear that such perks were illegal and would not be considered.
Yeah, because we talked about it in the Board of Governors, yeah.
Right, so Uncle Dennis went to owners.
is a badass negotiator. Yeah.
So you're saying that he didn't go to Steve Ballmer?
Well, maybe he did, right? But if Ballmer had any brains whatsoever, he just laughed at him.
All right. So there we have Uncle Dennis going to the owners. Mark Cuban says he's a badass negotiator. And he says if Ballmer had any brains, he laughed at him. And here Pablo is right. This is extremely relevant. Uncle Dennis, according to all reports, including information coming out of I can never remember if it's the Toronto Star or the Toronto Sun, but either way, from his time at the Raptors, and there you saw a quote from Jeannie Buss stating that Uncle Dennis had made these demands, outlandish demands, like looking for ownership, which he was never going to get of anything. But Uncle Dennis had already been engaged in this behavior before. So Pablo's saying, well, is it not likely that he would try this again with the Clippers? And Mark is acknowledging that. And I don't see how that's not relevant, because there we have the other part of this, is that the player is going to even ask this, is even going to broach the subject of salary cap circumvention. So there we have that first half. Yeah, it's not the more difficult half, but it is very relevant that Uncle Dennis was already engaged in this behavior. And so if he asked about that, presumably if he would have got it, then he would have stayed with the Raptors or potentially signed with the Lakers. And so what was it that caused Kawhi to land with the Clippers? So this is relevant information. And Mark laughs it away and just saying that if Steve Ballmer had any brains, he would have laughed at him. But it's not, again, there's this false equivalency. And I have a video on false equivalency. It's not a matter of Steve Ballmer being smart. Like, Steve Ballmer has the capability to understand everything that's going on, obviously. It's a matter of, is he risky enough? And so that's an important false equivalency that we see throughout the dialogue, not only in this episode, but more broadly on Twitter, is that the Clippers aren't this dumb. And it's not just Mark Cuban who is saying this. There's a false equivalency out there that the Clippers are dumb to have done this. It's not dumb. It's a matter of risk tolerance. And so you can argue whether their risk assessment was dumb, but here what we have is a risky team. And Pablo actually brings this up later because he talks about the trade. Clearly, this team was willing to go all in, take a risk, and make this trade. And then here we have, again, if Ballmer had any brains, he laughed at him. That's not it. It's a matter of risk assessment and whether or not that Steve Ballmer was okay with taking this risk. And so, yeah, it seems absurd when we look at it here in this light. But at the time, this is, as Mark says later, this happens all the time, that the NBA owners are approached with maybe family member or by family members, or for extras or sweeteners, as they are sometimes referred to. And so here, Pablo's bringing up a good point that Mark is dismissing. So let's continue on with the outline. Here we have Mark stating that, or Pablo states, Uncle Dennis is the one making the calls. And Mark says, well, isn't that a red flag to you? That this is a deal between Uncle Dennis and the two guys at the top of Aspiration, and not Steve Ballmer. So I think Mark has a point here, is that, if it's Uncle Dennis is the one that is making the demands, and it's not Steve Ballmer, then this is really a deal between Uncle Dennis and Aspiration. So it's a fair point to make. But then he adds, if your reporting is right, if Pablo's reporting is right, and Steve knew, then it's over. And then we have, continuing on, we have Mark saying, I'm not giving in that Ballmer knew this was going on. And he says, you haven't told me anything that makes me think otherwise. And then here I've added, how has nothing that Pablo has said made you think, in the very least, that anything has happened otherwise? Like, I understand that, we don't have any direct connection with Ballmer at this point, but we do also have some of the previous points that I've made. One being the last, that Uncle Dennis was willing to engage in this type of, let's call it negotiation loosely, and he's making these demands. And so we have that part of it. And then what did I mention earlier? That that Steve Ballmer had been caught earlier. He'd already been fined by the NBA for circumventing the salary cap. So I don't see how that isn't relevant. And I think that takes away from Mark's. Like, if Mark wanted to have a better defense, then part of that defense would have been to accept some of the givens that are already publicly known and state, yes, that goes against the Clippers defense. But here's why I still think what I think. But Mark really, he almost, we've seen him concede like a very quickly, a minor point, but he will not, he's very much like 98% that no, you are wrong. Everything is wrong. In fact, sometimes he'll say it's just the opposite of what you're thinking. So here's Marcus saying, I'm not giving in, which is again strange for a guy that starts out with, I don't have a dog in the race, I think is his phrase. It very much looks like he wants one dog to win, but there is that. And then so we'll continue on. And then Mark continues, you're not giving the scammers enough credit. You're assuming that Steve Ballmer has all of the leverage, knowledge, and awareness. And I do think that that's a good point from Mark, that, yeah, he did give. So Pablo looked at this in one light, and he was thinking that Steve Ballmer is so immersed in this and so involved. And even with his reporting, right, it's hard to extract yourself from the reporting. But even when you're reporting on this, you have to remember that this wasn't the only game in town at that time. Now it is. Now this is the talk of, really the sports sphere. But at the time, it wasn't something that was probably of immediate focus. It was just one of many things that was ongoing. So you have to also look at it in that light and be aware that this wasn't something that had all of Steve Ballmer's attention. So I do agree with Mark on that. So Pablo states that the scam was simple. Aspiration was basically sports washing to get credibility and obtain investments, and that Steve Ballmer should have done his due diligence. And he also states that 80 to 90% of the letters of intent, so intent to, I think, basically purchase carbon credits from Aspiration, are fake. And so here I just write that Pablo is wrong. Steve Ballmer is not going to be aware of every last thing. Let's see. And then we have here, I don't think it's a big contortion to say he found somebody who would keep a deal for his most important player who he needed to pay above salary cap to the tune of a $28 million secret. So that is coming from Pablo. Pablo adds, the scam here is not that these guys were very clever. It was that they're very stupid. So that goes back to the fake letters of intent, the fake LLCs that were involved with Aspiration. And then here we have, I think Mark was stating, I should have added this, a legitimate SPAC payday reason for Steve to get involved. So then Pablo adds, shouldn't Steve have known that his partner with his jersey patch and the name on the seats, that he should have known about this and done his due diligence? And then Mark adds, how is he going to know? So again, Mark is right. This is what I've talked about. Steve Ballmer is not going to know every last thing. And so here, this is why in the early part of this podcast, it's mostly Mark that's on the right side, because Pablo is focusing in on the wrong things. He's looking at this in terms of like, oh, Steve Ballmer is going to absolutely know this, because why wouldn't he know this? This is a jersey sponsor and someone he's doing a deal with. And what happened is what Mark explained, is that, look, like, you make these deals, you do the best you can, you have due diligence, you have your teams that are involved in due diligence, you go into secondary layers, right? The bigger the deal, maybe, and this is me continuing on from that, the bigger the deal, the more time you're going to spend, etc. But you're not going to sit there and look at every last thing. And then so we have another part where Pablo asks, I think this was Mark, why would the scammers tell 7 people inside the company that Steve Ballmer and salary cap circumvention is the reason we can't talk about this? And so that gets at Pablo's sources. So he comes back to his sources a lot. And this is a point of emphasis. So let's actually go to this clip.
And they got scammed just as badly as everybody else.
And their question
was, but that makes my point. That makes my point, Pablo, that the scammers.
But why would but you're saying the scammers are really good at scamming. Why would the scammers tell 7 people at least, and I'm told it was dozens who are aware of this, that Steve Ballmer and cap circumvention is the reason we can't talk about this?
No, I get your point again. But on the flip side, if I want to shut everybody up, hey, we're saving the world. But in order to get this $50 million investment, in order for us to be able to get the value of the sponsorship, I'm going to lie to you and tell you I did this deal, that Steve Ballmer's making us do these things, right? Everybody who works for us, stay focused. Don't talk to anybody about this, because if you do, that can make the whole thing fall apart.
But I feel like I'm giving
you the reason why you can't talk about it.
I feel like you're the greatest defense attorney for 2 scammers in terms of just like
I've been scammed. That's why I know I've been scammed.
But Mark, I want to square the circle, as I keep on saying.
All right, so I think that covers the point of emphasis. So Mark says, I get your point. So Pablo does make a good point. It's like, why would the scammers, so the people inside of Aspiration that are actually pulling off the fraud, why would they tell 7 employees inside of the company that like the Kawhi Leonard contract is for Steve Ballmer and salary cap circumvention, and we can't, and there's the reason, and I think that is the reason we can't talk about this. So Mark quickly adds, I get your point, and then he goes on this extended point that I'm not completely able to make sense of. I understand what he's saying generally, but I don't understand how that makes the point of, hey, it explains away that they're going to tell these people that Steve Ballmer is the reason we're doing this. And so here, if I'm Mark, I just state that, like, look, these are sources inside of the company. Maybe they want to be a part of the story. Like, we don't know, because here, this is where Pablo's reporting, he needs to keep in mind that the sources are really ancillary to his main evidence, which his main evidence is the documentation. The documentation is where you want to focus in on, and then strategically add in the sources where possible. Now, I know the sources helped him get the documentation, but the quotes from the sources aren't where you want to focus in on. There's something that you bring in on top of it, but my focus is going to be the documentation. Here, Mark makes the argument that Mark is making, and he says, but if I want to shut everybody up, hey, we're saving the world, but in order to get this $50 million investment, in order for us to be able to get the value of the sponsorship, I'm going to lie to you, and I tell you I did this deal with Steve Ballmer, is making us do these things, right? Everybody who works for us, stay focused. Don't talk to anybody about this, because you can make the whole thing fall apart. But I'm giving you the reason why you can't talk about it. That just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, even as he explains it, I don't even see why you would need to make up that lie. You could just say something to the effect of, hey, this is really important. Like, we need to keep this is confidential, that we have. I don't know. But I wouldn't go so far as to say the reason why we're doing this sponsorship with Kawhi is that so that we can circumvent the salary cap. Like, why would you even add that? So that to me did not make sense. But that is one of Mark's points. There you heard Pablo say that you're the greatest defense attorney for 2 scammers. Mark pulls back. No, I've been scammed. And so Pablo asks, how can these guys be smart enough to pull off something like this, but stupid enough to tell the people inside of the company? And Mark says, you're missing my point. How else do you get these people to shut up and stay focused on your job? And then Pablo, you've given them the recipe to tell a reporter. Again, that wouldn't be where I'm thinking here. Pablo gets into this possibility that down the line this could come out and they could tell a journalist. Also, keep in mind that if someone's running a scam and they're defrauding people, they're probably not too concerned with they're not really that concerned with the somewhat at least relatively distant future. They're more thinking in terms of the now. So Mark adds, one part where I think Mark got off track was he adds, how many of them even know how the CBA works? So in reference to telling the employees like that there's a salary cap circumvention, Mark says, well, how do they even know how the CBA works? And then Pablo replies, well, it's not especially complicated as a concept, which it's not. And then Mark says, no, it's easy. So that was a strange interaction where Mark just had something he threw out there, and then he quickly let it go because it wasn't going to go anywhere. So now we get to a point where Mark says, and I guess I'm going to go through the entire outline. So this will be a long episode, but if you are into this corporate conspiracy thriller, then this will, I think there will be a fair amount of people that are interested in the details here, because keep in mind, this is so important because here we are looking at the best possible defense to take away from Pablo's evidence. We've seen how compelling Pablo's evidence is, but let's take it away let's take out Pablo's investigative journalism and just look at it for what it is. And not only look at it for what it is, but look at the antagonist here in this story, that is Mark Cuban, that provides us this insight that we can never get anywhere else or from very few places. So Mark adds, if you hadn't told me it was Uncle Dennis to make the call, it was Uncle Dennis to make the call, I would have been more likely to believe that Steve was at fault. So they're stating Uncle Dennis is the one making the demands to Aspiration. It's not Steve Ballmer that's putting the pressure on them. It's Uncle Dennis. So that would suggest that there was a deal between Kawhi and Uncle Dennis and Aspiration. So that means that Steve Ballmer is outside of the picture, and there really was this innocent deal, right, where it was just 1-to-1, and Kawhi and Uncle Dennis, and they've got to get their money from Aspiration, and they can't go to Steve Ballmer because it's Steve Ballmer's not a part of this. And then he adds, because if Steve knew, and the minute he found out that this was falling apart and these guys were a scam, he'd say, let me invest some more money so that you can pay off Kawhi, so this whole thing goes away. And there's no evidence of it any longer, and let's just erase it from the books. You don't leave this outstanding debt out there. And particularly once you see that you're going on a path to going broke, and you potentially know, you understand enough, and I think we've all had enough experience with bankruptcies, that those creditors are going to become public. So that's what happened. And Mark, being aware of that, is saying, like, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to let there be an outstanding creditor. If I'm Steve Ballmer, I'm going to give that money to Aspiration so that they can pay Kawhi, and Kawhi is no longer a creditor. Because that's where you got this story, right? Yes, Pablo got this from a bankruptcy filing. And so you know the whole due diligence, smart enough to know right applies to that as well. He's leaving himself so wide open that he's going to be smart enough not to be, if he's truly breaking the rules. So saying that if Steve Ballmer was actually breaking the rules here, he's going to be smart enough to cover his tracks with money so that it's not a problem later on. And then he adds, if Ballmer was involved and he just didn't immediately square the circle, to use your term, the minute things went sour, he's a fucking moron. So Pablo adds, you're saying save Aspiration to prevent bankruptcy. And here we get to another point of emphasis. So let's go to 38. Let's go to like right here.
Stand enough, and I think we've all had enough experiences with bankruptcies, that those creditors are going to become public. And because that's where you got the story, right? And so that's, the whole due diligence, smart enough to know, right? It applies to that as well. He's leaving himself so wide open in a way that he's going to be smart enough not to be, if he's truly breaking the rules. If Ballmer was involved and he didn't just immediately square the circle, to use your term, the minute things went sour, he's a fucking moron.
You're saying save Aspiration personally to prevent bankruptcy, to prevent all of this stuff.
That's one option. Or invest more money, right? And just tell them to pay off Kawhi. Because it would have made no sense to do this on an annual basis. It would have made a lot more sense to pay it off, put it away. Nobody knows any better.
Okay, we'll go ahead and stop the clip there. So obviously now, knowing the information that has come out later after this podcast was recorded, now we know that there were a chain of events that very much unfolded, like in terms of the Clippers funding Aspiration and pouring in money to Aspiration. As Pablo Torre reported in his last episode before this podcast episode was recorded, it was a total of $118 million that was transferred from the Clippers to Aspiration. So there, Pablo Torre not letting on any more information, but I did want to emphasize that part in the podcast. And then so Pablo asks, would you still throw in another $50 million after your original $50 million if you thought one of these guys was going to plead guilty to fraud? And then Mark responds, he knows he's fucked at that point. And then I have emphasis. I'm going to go to Uncle Dennis and I'm saying, forget these guys. Here's the 30 million. So one problem with this is that, yes, that is going to square Kawhi and Uncle Dennis because they'll have been paid in full. The problem with that is that if Aspiration goes under, right? If they do file for bankruptcy, and then we see those creditors come out, then there's still Uncle Dennis and Kawhi would still be a creditor on the list, unless Uncle Dennis, unless somehow Uncle Dennis and Kawhi say that we're no longer creditors before the bankruptcy papers come out. And then Mark continues, if Steve was dumb enough to go down this path in the first place, then he's got to keep digging. So here we have really Pablo Torre and Mark Cuban taking opposing sides still. And then Mark Cuban adding, I'm saying he didn't know what was going on, and that's why there was no response. So this makes, I think this is a decent point, because here you see the really Steve Ballmer not, at the time of this podcast, Steve Ballmer was not doing this given the facts that we had at this time. So I think that's what's happening here is Mark saying that I'm saying he didn't know what was going on, and that's why you didn't see the Clippers doing these actions. And so here we have Mark saying, you're saying it's all falling apart and they're going to do nothing. And then Pablo saying, I'm saying they didn't have a move to make because there was criminal activity. So yeah, that puts a stop in this, right? That's the other part of the story, is that the government got involved. So it really left the Clippers with no option but to sit there and watch the rest of this happen, because at that point they've lost any control, any influence over the situation. So then we have Pablo, all those sources and documents are internal to Aspiration. And then Pablo says, I believe they're the most credible. And then Mark says it's the exact opposite. And then we have, if I told you the questions about this deal existed preceded 2022, would that change your level of belief? And then Mark says no, because there's no confirmation that Steve knew anything. So now we're to the point where Mark's stating that, hey, like, you've shown me this, right? Like, you've given me this evidence, or you've made these different points of contention, but there's nothing that confirms Steve knows anything. So that should at least give Mark the ability to state, like, look, like, you do have, there are some pieces of evidence that you've put forth, right? And some logical assertions that you've made that do give rise to some level of suspicion, but I'm going to remain on my side because there's no confirmation that Steve knew anything here. And so I think that would be Mark's best approach, is somewhat of a measured one rather than a polar extreme one. And the polar extreme being like, I'm defending Steve Ballmer, Team Ballmer, regardless of what you say. And he's only really offering ifs. So if this, then that statements, rather than like, I'll concede that you have a point here. And so we get to another point of emphasis. So Mark states, if Uncle Dennis approaches the scammers, not knowing they're scammers, and say, hey, you just signed a $300 million deal with the Clippers. Who's the best player? Let's make a deal with Kawhi. He won't do anything. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So let's actually go to that point, because I want to hear that again. 4309.
And I believe that they are the most credible people for the reasons I
No,
said.
exact opposite.
No.
Exact opposite.
If I were to tell you that the questions about why does this deal exist preceded 2022, would that change your level of belief in Team Bricks?
No, because it doesn't
Why?
provide any confirmation that Steve knew anything.
But it happened before there was a need
No, still.
to spam.
So, like I said, the scammers, Uncle Dennis goes to the scammers and says, not knowing they're scammers at the time, say, hey, you just signed this $300 million deal with the Clippers. Who's the best player on the Clippers? Who represents the Clippers the best? Who's going to be here long after they're gone? Work with me. Let's do a deal with Kawhi. And if Kawhi's going to play, whatever. No, he's not going to show up and hug trees. He's not going to show up and talk about,
He's not going to do anything.
offsets.
Literally anything.
Okay, that doesn't make any sense to me. So again, why is Aspiration doing this deal with Kawhi when, like, okay, he's their best player, but what again? Again, we come back to this $28 million contract with Aspiration, between Kawhi and Aspiration. Again, why is this taking place? Because that's the one piece of evidence that we keep coming back to and we can't get around. How does this make any sense on the part of Aspiration? And then Mark is saying that Uncle Dennis came to Aspiration with a deal, and there's no reason to. So let's go back to the outline here. Uncle Dennis approaching the scammers. At this point, he doesn't know that they're scammers, right? We're assuming that Aspiration's a legitimate company, and we're not assuming that. That's just what is known at the time. And then he's Uncle Dennis is taking advantage of this $300 million deal, and he's saying, hey, we've got the best player here of the Clippers, the team that you just signed this $300 million deal with. Let's make a deal with the Kawhi, but he won't do anything. And then but Mark adds, that's still not proof that Ballmer knew. But that is something you have to contend with, right? Like, if you're the defense for Steve Ballmer, how do you counter that? And then that's what so much of this comes back to. We just look at this initial contract. We can't get around it. How do you get around the fact that he didn't have to do anything for the money? And so even, like, all of Pablo's evidence that he's put forth, like the evidence subsequent here. Again, it's like, how do we get around the fact that Kawhi Leonard did not have to do anything for this money other than agree to stay with the Clippers? And if he didn't, then he wouldn't get the money. So we'll continue on. We have here, Pablo, my sources state that the KL2 Aspire LLC was specifically for circumventing the salary cap and providing documentation, including the contract, bank statements, and emails, and that there was no other KPIs involved other than play for the Clippers. And then Mark responds, but none of that connects Steve Ballmer. So yeah, like that's the sources aren't weak. The sources are actually compelling and they're strong, but they're not the foundational evidence. They go on top of the foundational evidence. So I'm not saying that Pablo is wrong to bring in the sources. They are relevant. But when, if we have Mark Cuban here, in effect, acting as a defense attorney, like for the court of, what is it called? They call it the podcast court. For podcast court, Mark Cuban is the defense attorney. And he's right. This doesn't connect Steve Ballmer, even though you have this and you have these people that are saying this. You still haven't shown me that Steve Ballmer is involved. And then Pablo adds, but all of the sources say that it was at the direction of Steve Ballmer. And then Mark responds, well, what email? And then Pablo says there were no emails. They were told this. And then Mark says, well, who told them? And then Pablo says it was common knowledge at the company. And that's just, even in podcast court, it's like, okay, common knowledge, they all say it, but like, show me where, right? And so even though this is circumstantial evidence, even though it's decent evidence, it's not something that we want to rely on. And then so Mark adds that doesn't implicate Steve Ballmer. And then Mark says it comes down to the credibility of the people who told the employees who say it was at the direction of Steve Ballmer. So they're stating that maybe the employees didn't have the right information. Maybe someone told them something else and they were misled, which gets us back to, well, maybe they were just being told by scammers and the scammers were just making up a story for whatever reason. So Pablo says, well, it's the only thing that makes any sense. And then Pablo adds, it's Occam's razor, which means that when there are competing explanations, that the simplest one with the fewest explanations or the fewest assumptions is the most likely to be true. And I also think that is relevant here. It's like when we look at what's going on and look at all of the possibilities, what is the most likely outcome? What is the most likely to have been true? What's most likely is that the Clippers were circumventing the salary cap. Mark says not even close. I don't know how that's not even close, right? So that's just Mark going complete opposite. So I think that might actually be a tactic of his, is when there is a point, is to go to the extreme and try to diffuse that point by going so far away from it. But Occam's razor is definitely relevant here. And that's part of the reason why I'm recording this episode, is because we want to look at the strongest defense for the Clippers and see if there is any other possible explanation. But none has been put forth by Steve Ballmer on his ESPN interview. He spoke on this briefly at the Front Office Sports Tuned In Summit. We've also seen the Clippers release multiple statements. We haven't seen anything that explains this away from the Clippers side. We just see a denial, really. So Occam's razor definitely relevant here. And then Mark's bias is shown again. So Pablo continues, you're saying the scammers were smart enough to tell the employees don't tell anybody, but stupid enough not to realize that they would one day tell a journalist. This is a horrible point by Pablo. And then Mark responds, every Ponzi scheme falls apart at one point. And then he provides the illustration of the example of Bernie Madoff, where smart investors got scammed. So again, going back to Pablo's point of like, well, Steve Ballmer got scammed. He should have looked into this. And Mark's like, yeah, smart investors get scammed, which is true. That's a good point by Mark. And that goes back to Pablo's earlier point, as I was stating. Mark adds, I haven't heard anything that takes me off of Team Ballmer. And he says there's a lot of uncertainty. I just don't see it. So I think if we're going to look at this in the most favorable light to Mark is stating that, hey, look, like you've put out a lot of information, but there's nothing here that shows me that Steve Ballmer is connected. So really taking like a criminal defense mindset of like, you've got to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And for you to do that, you have to show me that Steve Ballmer is connected, and you just haven't done that so far. So Pablo responds that he brings back up the DeAndre Jordan point, which is a good point to bring up. He went head to head with you, Steve Ballmer, for DeAndre Jordan with a side endorsement deal with Lexus and was fined. And then 2019, owners are saying Uncle Dennis is a guy asking for stuff, and then rules are changed because of that. And then in 2021, we have Steve Ballmer signing Kawhi to a deal that is convenient to the Clippers. So here we get into a side point about the deal itself. And it was the max deal, but Kawhi didn't go as long or as short as he could have. Basically, the implication here being that Kawhi could have had more money guaranteed or could have strategically lowered the deal amount, the number of years, to potentially get more money after the initial shorter deal. Mark states he only gave up optionality. Mark, there is no equivalency. It's not like he gave up $7 million. So they're being like, hey, like as far as like the connection here between the $7 million a year and the deal that Kawhi signed, there's no connection. And Mark here is right. So I think this is Pablo adding, at this time, Aspiration becomes a sponsor for $300 million. Steve Ballmer invests $50 million. And then Mark adds, but why $28 million? And then Pablo adds, well, it's less than $50 million. And then Mark adds, well, why $7 million a year? And so here, this is Mark making good counterpoints to Pablo's allusion to the fact that there is something amiss, and Mark stating basically that the numbers don't add up. So you're throwing this out here, but you don't have anything to connect it, essentially. And then Mark actually volunteers that the amount of the salary cap circumvention is irrelevant, which is true. But then Pablo brings him back to where he should keep going in on. And he states, when Steve Ballmer got fined $250,000, doesn't that seem like a big deal? And let's now go back to the video. And I think we need to go to 5248.
In that regard, when Steve Ballmer tried to sign DeAndre Jordan to that deal and got fined $250, doesn't that feel like an important detail when calculating, are you team Ballmer or are you team bricks?
Yeah, but I would take the other side saying you learn really quick.
Okay, that Mark Cuban right there, that was a definite win, right? A definite mark in the win column for Pablo. So what happens, we've seen this a few times, when Pablo has a point, Mark quickly pivots away from that point. Yeah, but, and then he goes to the other side. So that's actually a really good point. It's good for Pablo. I mean, the DeAndre Jordan, the DeAndre Jordan circumvention is extremely relevant here. And so here we have Mark saying, yeah, but I would take the other side, saying you learn really quick. So Mark's contention the whole time was that there's no connection to Steve Ballmer, but then when faced with the evidence that the NBA has caught Steve Ballmer doing this very thing, he moves right past this, and this is disingenuous. So going back to the whole Steve Ballmer, Team Ballmer thing, it's like, why wouldn't this at least make you think about it, right? Like if Mark wants to come across more genuine, then he's going to say, well, that's a good point. I just don't, I don't see the connection. And also, I would say that the very fact that he's been fined before, he's been through this, would make him not want to do this again. And Mark partially gets to that, but you have to concede that it actually looks bad. And all we have as the part of a concession is a quick yeah, but. So he moves right past it. All right, so let's go ahead. We've covered that. And so Mark adds, the NBA gives you a stern warning not to do this again, and it increases the risk profile for you doing it again. So basically that, hey, you've done this once before, you got fined $250,000, but if you do it again, this time it's going to be worse. And then Pablo asks, well, what if you sign someone to an endorsement deal where nobody knows about it? Mark, no NBA owner is dumb enough to think, and then he continues, and then Pablo inserts, but DeAndre Jordan. And then Mark says, well, hopefully he learned his lesson from that. And Pablo asks, well, why assume that? And then Mark states, on all of the evidence I've given you. And then Pablo rightly states that you haven't provided evidence, just logic on how you would do things. So Pablo definitely won that exchange, but he's got a good point with DeAndre Jordan. And so it's good that he continues on that continuum. And then so here we have Mark, and I think this was a jump clip. I'm not sure, because remember that Pablo had to condense this episode down because he said that initially the original recording was 2 hours and 45 minutes. So he had to make it, I think, able to be condensed down to a podcast time length. And I think this was probably the relevant sections. But anyways, 5507, we have Mark. What do you think when FTX hit? And then I don't know who adds this. Mark adds, all those people sold, they reacted. And then Pablo responds, they also hid and hoped nothing would happen. And then Mark asserts that that's where we disagree. They hoped, please don't let Pablo find it. I don't think that happened. Pablo responds, at a certain point, it becomes obvious that aspiration can't pay its bills. At that point, you're beginning to worry. Let's say Ballmer wasn't aware of the scam, but he's aware of the government is looming, that investigations are coming, and that criminality is afoot. At that point, what do you do with aspiration is a question you're going to have to answer to the federal government. You're not going to put in an extra $50 million. Mark disagrees with that. And so here, let's actually go to this other clip.
And said, please, Lord, let none of this come out. And
Suggested before, 50 extra million.
No, that's where we disagree. Yeah, that's where we disagree.
You think he would put in an extra $50 million and give it to a criminal?
Well, at that point in time, he's probably, because he doesn't know for sure. There's been many companies. So, okay.
When did you treat Steve Ballmer like a really smart adult? When did
Pablo shouldn't have interrupted Mark here. He should have let Mark keep going, because Mark stumbled on that question, because it was something where, okay, you're going to keep putting in 50 million, even though a government investigation is looming. And you saw Mark's reaction. Like, he had to think about it. And then he initially stumbled. And then Pablo, in a way, saved him because he interrupted.
Well, at that point in time, he's probably, because he doesn't know for sure. There's been many companies. So, okay.
When did you treat Steve Ballmer like a really smart adult? When is that going to happen?
No, I just know my experiences, right? Having invested in companies.
So that allows Mark to reset, come back to more of a default general stance and not answer that question directly. So Pablo should not have interrupted him there. That was one of the times. Mark is usually so quick and he's usually so fluid in his responses. And that time he actually had to take a step back and think about it. So that would have been good if Pablo just let that continue. But let's go back to the outline. And then here we have that was a good point, though. When do you treat Steve Ballmer like a really smart adult? And yeah, so again, Mark is giving Steve Ballmer every possible benefit of the doubt he can. And then, but Mark does reset. And then here I have choice misspelled, but Mark says he does have that choice. He could have put in more money. And then he adds in January 2024, probably not. So Mark rebounds to this and he actually provides a decent answer. And then we have, but the government contacted him and said the Clippers were not under investigation. So at that time, why not cover any loose ends? And then Pablo goes back to something he had done once before and really goes back to Steve Ballmer being such a great investor. And he says, I'm not the greatest investor in the last 20 years. And then Mark says, you're trying to use that to justify you're using that to justify your position. And it's true. And so that's weak on Pablo's part, and he shouldn't be bringing this up. And then Pablo adds, well, it's part of his expertise to know that when the bills aren't getting paid. And Mark says that's a big part of your argument that doesn't hold up. So let's actually go to this, because that is something very much in favor of Mark here.
Need to express that as well, because I'm not the guy who was called the greatest investor of the last 20 years, as Steve Ballmer has been, because of what he did with Microsoft.
You're using that as a way to justify your position.
No, but it's a part of his expertise to know that when the bills aren't getting paid, what's happening. And
that's a big part of your argument, Pablo. That doesn't hold up.
But
right?
But I get that.
It doesn't hold up at all, right? So Mark is absolutely right. This should not be a go-to for Pablo. Mark or Steve Ballmer being a good investor or great investor is not really, and Steve Ballmer not paying attention to details. That shouldn't be any major theme that Pablo has. And Mark seizes upon this. Not necessarily he was looking for the opportunity, but Mark rightly gets him on this when it tells him, look, that's a big part of what you're saying, and that's not what's going on here. So let's go back to the outline. And then, so at just over an hour in, Mark asks, well, who is the linchpin in everything? And then Pablo says Steve Ballmer, and then Mark says, no, it's Uncle Dennis. And then Mark adds, if you only have 7 million left to go, don't you just take care of it? And then Pablo goes back to some Bloomberg reporting that preceded Pablo's reporting. And here we have Aspiration's accountants uncovered a series, and I've uncovered twice, a series of payments that sent panic through the executive suite. Some staffers worried that company officials might be inflating numbers through fake transactions. And then Mark replies, well, when I was scammed, when I asked reports, do you think I was told the truth? And then Pablo responds, there are people in the finance department are the ones who caught the scammers. The people who you're saying might have been lied to by the scammers are the ones who caught the scammers. So that's a really good point. Is these people, it's really, you can't say that they were lied to because they're the ones that caught the people that were lying, I think is essentially what's happening here. And then we get to the point where neither of us are budging. So Pablo just acknowledges like, hey, like we're at a stalemate here. Neither of us is going to convince the other one. And then, but we do come back. There are a few more points, and then Pablo asks, well, who would have known from the Clippers? And Mark says there's a good chance it could just be only the owner, so only Steve Ballmer. And then he adds, if he did tell Florence Frank or the assistant GMs, their career is done. The agent, he adds, is fucked as well. So Kawhi Leonard's agent, which I believe his name is Mitch Frankel. And then Mark adds that Steve Ballmer and Uncle Dennis are under a microscope, meaning that they're less likely to do this because they are being so closely watched because of their previous history. And then Pablo adds that Uncle Dennis should have known better. And then Mark replies that I have no problem with Uncle Dennis. He's the smart one in all of this. And then we continue forward. And I think Pablo adds in something like, you really want Steve Ballmer. You really want to defend Steve Ballmer and the Clippers. And then Mark replies, no, I don't give a shit one way or the other. I hope I'm wrong. My experience tells me you're wrong. And then Mark says, I look at the math and the leverage, and I don't see the value proposition anywhere. You know, Mark definitely cares. I mean, he's shown over the course of the last few weeks that he very much is invested in this. So he definitely does care. And he is very much on the side of Steve Ballmer and the Clippers. So then at roughly a minute and 6 minutes in, Mark asks Pablo, is it conceivable that Uncle Dennis bluffed and goes to Aspiration and says that I'm going to take Kawhi out of here if you don't pay me $28 million and then your sponsorship isn't worth anything? This is very weak. And I think we saw this position earlier, but just basically that, hey, I'm in control here. And if I say that Kawhi should leave, if you don't pay me the $28 million, so here being the bluff, then your sponsorship isn't worth anything. This is a really weak line, like just a flimsy line to throw out by Mark, but it's a theory. And then Pablo responds, it's likelier that deal happens, but with the blessing of the team. So that opens the door for Mark to emphatically shut the door. And Mark says, no. And Mark is right. So it doesn't really first of all, you don't want to extend off of something that is already so shaky to begin with. So Uncle Dennis bluffing to Aspiration that if they don't pay him the sponsorship, they don't pay him the $28 million, then their $300 million sponsorship isn't worth anything. That's just a really flimsy story that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's conceivable that it could happen, that Uncle Dennis could go and make the bluff, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it would be such an obvious bluff. And then so that would mean that Aspiration has to fall for that bluff. And then that's why they ended up paying him the $28 million not to do anything. That sounds like something Mark thought of as a plausible reason, but it just doesn't seem practical at all. And then Pablo builds upon that, and then he says it's likelier that deal happens, but with the blessing of the team, it doesn't really even make any sense. So Mark is right here, like, and so he opened that door for Pablo and then shut it on him because Pablo, Pablo, it's not going to happen with the blessing of the team. So continuing on, Mark brings this back to, it really comes down to who initiated that contract. Was it the agent? Was it the Clippers? Was it Uncle Dennis? And then Mark bets on it being Uncle Dennis. How would this be through Uncle Dennis? I could see Uncle Dennis in a way it becoming a part of Uncle Dennis stating like, hey, we're not going to do anything for this money. This is just extra money that you're going to pay us. I can see that the insistence upon that and that becoming a part of the contract, but it very much looks like here we've got a no-show deal that was additional money paid to Kawhi at the behest of the Clippers. That's what it appears to be to me. And then then we have Pablo stating that the story around Kawhi Leonard was that he's been asking for side endorsement deals and sweeteners that are off the books. Mark responds, well, this happens all the time. So I don't know that that's the case. Possibly it is, right? Very, very possibly it is. But even if it is the case, we do know that Kawhi Leonard was asking, and not just asking for any extras. This wasn't just tickets to the game, right? This wasn't just use of the private jet, whatever it might be. This was extra, like material extra money, not just an experience, um, not just a throw in, but this was a significant amount of money at the time this podcast was recorded. $28 million. Of course, later it came to be 48 with the additional stock options, but it is relevant that Kawhi Leonard and his uncle were asking for all of these extras that were off the books, and not just endorsement deals, because I can see endorsement deals happening a lot and asking to open the door to endorsement deals. But here we're going well beyond just your traditional endorsement deal. And of course, what really seals this is that Kawhi Leonard never did anything. So I do think, one of the points that I hear coming across is that, well, if he'd have done anything, then we could have justified this contract. I disagree. It wouldn't have just been anything. We do need to see some type of substantial reciprocity where it's not just Kawhi liking a tweet or whatever it would be, like showing up for one appearance. That's not $28 million worth. Especially, I think what looks especially damning is when we look at these other A-list celebrities, which were Robert Downey Jr. We had Drake as well. We had Leonardo DiCaprio. We had Cindy Crawford, and combined, along with, there were a few other celebrities or known personalities, but combined, I think they received less than a quarter of what Kawhi did. And we also saw, I could also believe from Pablo's sources that this was problematic inside of the marketing department because their budget is being used up by a guy that is not contributing whatsoever. Let's see here. We have Pablo adding in that in 2019, when presented with the opportunity to get Kawhi Leonard, Steve Ballmer did whatever Kawhi's camp asked. And we have the trade reference, and then Mark responds, I get your point, but where do you stop? It's a really good point. It's a really good point because Steve Ballmer, the Clippers mortgaged their future to get Kawhi Leonard. So clearly they wanted him really, really bad. And it stands to reason that if they were willing to mortgage their future and make this colossal trade that has in turn made Sam Presti look like a genius GM, because the Oklahoma City Thunder not only has an embarrassment of riches in terms of current talent, but they're still cashing in on future draft picks. It stands to reason that if the Clippers were willing to make that trade, that all-in trade, I mean, that is a 100% conviction when you make that trade, that we also have an owner that has shown that he is willing, and he has been punished by the NBA for circumventing the salary cap, then it makes a lot of sense that they would circumvent the salary cap to get Kawhi Leonard in 2019. And then Pablo goes back to 2019 because it's the pattern of behavior from the DeAndre Jordan circumvention, where he got what he wanted. But Mark's point is that he stopped acting like this because he was scared straight. And then he continues, if the catalyst was Uncle Dennis, I couldn't think of anything dumber because you're going to go to and I think this is Mark. If the catalyst is Uncle Dennis, I couldn't think of anything dumber because you're going to go to the very person that required the Board of Governor meetings to stop that behavior. Remember, but then we have here Mark stating, I get your point. And then Pablo says, you're desperate to keep this player. And then Mark just says, I don't think it was a binary set of circumstances like this. I don't see it. I think it's far more likely that Uncle Dennis was the catalyst with the crooks. I don't think you can presume that everything with aspiration is the equivalent with a legitimate company. They both state from their points of view that they think this is obvious. Mark responds, to me, it's so point blank obvious that, look, both of us could be wrong. One of us could be right. We'll find out over time. I just can't see him going in that direction. I just don't. I do not see how this goes. Mark is wrong here. Right? We have over an hour of recording where Mark gives his best attempt diffusing this and at really undermining Pablo's evidence. And it doesn't bear out, right? Mark makes some good points and Pablo makes some weak ones. But Pablo's evidence, if we keep going back to that, it's very strong and it's very compelling, and nothing in this recording nothing in this recording undermined or took away from the fact that Kawhi Leonard had a $28 million contract and he wasn't required to do anything for that. Boston Sports Journal later reports Kawhi's contract also included $20 million of stock options. So a $48 million contract wasn't required to do anything, significantly more than other celebrities who have way more appeal, strongest, and we see all of these other endorsers being paid so much less, and nothing Mark said really took away from that. He made some good points throughout. But Pablo also made really good points, and Pablo's best points were when he brought Mark back to the evidence. And when we looked at the past and the DeAndre Jordan circumvention being something that is really, really important to this story, and just looking at the best defense at the time, shortly after the initial podcast release, there's nothing that Mark said here that's really going to take away from this. Mark's continuing point was that Steve Ballmer was not involved. You can't show he wasn't involved, but that's not, that is really is that just because we don't have a direct connection with Steve Ballmer, we don't need to hold the requirement of evidence to that strict of a standard. Here we have so much evidence surrounding the Clippers and Steve Ballmer and pointing directly towards them circumventing the salary cap, that just because we can't definitively say, hey, Steve Ballmer made this sponsorship happen and then funneled money into why. Just because we don't have that directly, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And of course, as has been later presented by Pablo, there is more evidence that shows that this is in fact what has happened. So just breaking this episode down, looking at the strongest defense at the time, it was still, there's nothing that's taking away from Pablo's podcast. So I will include a link to this outline in the description. At some point, I'll come back to this video and there will probably be an update of some kind. When that happens, I will include the update in the description. So if you're watching this video, make sure to refer to the description just in case anything else has come forward. I'll also have a comment pinned with any additional information and then edit that as is necessary. But for now, I wanted to make this podcast because it's very important when we look at Pablo's evidence, and it is very strong and compelling evidence. We want to make sure that it's as strong as we think it is. So the best way to do that is try to undermine that evidence. And here we have Mark Cuban attempting to do just that, defending Steve Ballmer and the Clippers. So we've seen Mark Cuban's position and putting that best defense forward. But nothing that Mark Cuban said in this episode made me think that the Los Angeles Clippers and Steve Ballmer did not circumvent the salary cap.